experimentation strategist with Speero. He's a fanatic for creating high-value experiences and has been doing so since 2013. He's worked on some incredible teams spanning from B2B, such as Gartner, to B2C, such as Norwegian Cruise Line and Edible Arrangements. He's joined us today to talk more about how experimentation works and why it's so important. Uh, Over to you, Shiva. Tell us a little about yourself and what do you do, why it's so important.
So my career path into experimentation was quite interesting. I thought I was going to become a doctor. As you could tell, I'm Indian, and there's a lot of Indian folks who always tend to become doctors. I fucking hated medicine. I really hated it. It was so boring to me. And I love doctors. I love what they do for sure. It's just not for me. But growing up, super big into digital stuff, super big into like math. So I think that, and like psychology. So the perfect blend of experimentation is like user psychology, especially around web behavior, statistics, obviously. And then it's really interesting because a lot of these tests that you run are just, you're learning so much about user behavior. And it's a little low key toxic because you're manipulating user behavior, but you're doing it with a better intention, right? Like you're trying to make sure that you create better user experiences.
Yes.
I guess with great power comes great responsibility. And at least us as good experimenters, we have to make sure we're not hacking experimentation for the wrong KPIs. You're hacking it towards creating a better user experience. But that's kind of where my path was, that I figured I'd just do experimentation because that seemed like the perfect fit.
That's amazing. I sort of live on the boundaries of all marketers are liars sometimes. So yes, you've also been in the experimentation space right from the building days of, say, e-com or digital. How has that journey been for you?
It's really interesting that what I saw way back in the day was like these crappy GeoCity sites, and like, man, these sites that you just look at and like the conversion rate optimization was like, we'll animate the buttons and we'll like have like a rainbow banner and like these really crappy word art. Like now it's, some people still try and hack that, but it's still like interesting to see how much user behavior has transitioned towards sometimes being trained by big companies like Amazon and Walmart. But it's really interesting to see the transition from those type of sites to sites that truly value customer experience and create an experience that works well. And now also having to think about like, I mean, not now, like, but transitioning towards like making those sites work on mobile devices and then apps and then like smart TVs and like the tablets. It's really interesting to see how all of these things have transitioned and moved towards that. I think what's also interesting for me is looking at a little bit of like the e-commerceization, as that's a word that I've now made up about B2B, and seeing how like you could add software to a shopping cart and like how they've tried to take principles from e-commerce and translate it to B2B. But then there's certain companies like luxury brands who are taking rules out of the playbook of B2B and translating that to e-commerce. So there is a little bit of like a blending going on that I think is pretty cool, that you could take inspiration from any different source. And as long as you're testing it, make your own unique experience.
That's lovely. Back in the day, did you feel like that wasn't the right approach, or did it feel like that we're still ahead? Like we're kickstarting. Did you know that this was going to make it very big and become very widely known?
I had no, I learned to stop guessing about where things are going, because it seems like every guess has just been taken in a different direction. Like I never expected experimentation to blow up the way it did. Although truthfully, not everyone does it that well, but I never expected it to become this popular and this much of a career path for a lot of people, to the point that you're not just running A/B tests, you have whole programs with data scientists and teams are building their own internal tools. Like the maturity of experimentation has grown so far, and I didn't anticipate that. I anticipated it as just another single person running tests within the toolkit of a marketing team But now you have pioneers like Amazon and Booking.com that have just such robust experimentation programs. I've learned to just stop guessing and just enjoying the ride.
That's part of the trade, right?
Yeah.
So what does a typical day for you look like?
So at Speero, one of the things I love about it is we've kind of specialized our roles in really good ways. I was a one-man team for a lot of years across these companies of Norwegian and Gartner, and eventually grew my team. But starting early off, it was a one-man team where I was a little bit of the designer, a little bit of the developer, a little bit of the, strategist, a little bit of the program manager. So one of the nice things I love about Sphero is the opportunity to delegate down some of the work, or I don't want to say delegate down, more so like take a little bit of the project management work towards someone who is solely dedicated to project management and pushing initiatives forward, and then delegating some potentially all the dev work down to the developer team that we have. And I think that works incredibly well because they're the experts at what they do. So that helps make me a better overall strategist and helps me focus on being a strategist. So a lot of client work, working with clients to talk through some of their processes, but a lot of it's just kind of taking a look at the data that we have, looking at the experiments that we have, the research that we have, and starting to build a strategy for these clients, and then executing on that to make sure that we're linking our experimentation knowledge with their business goals and initiatives to create a program and a strategy that solves for their problems while still being in line with the bandwidth of good experimentation.
Right. That sounds great. I sort of relate to that. A lot of D2C teams, even today, there's like one person handling multiple roles, and sometimes you just want to step back and spend more time thinking. So that's sort of a challenge and a fight for us sometimes. Yeah. And maybe just we might want to know what you love to do when you're not experimenting.
I love hockey. Unfortunately, my team lost in the conference finals, but I love watching hockey, and I think a lot of it has to do with really geeking out on type of data. So I mean, like as an experimenter, right? I love data. It's funny. I was actually talking to a coworker about this too. Like, she was really mad that I asked her, like, what are you going to do on your vacation? And she's like, well, I have a whole spreadsheet of stuff that I'm going to do. And I'm like, but do you have it prioritized? And then we started talking about like when I'm searching for apartments or a new house, I have a prioritization framework to prioritize how close is it to the grocery store? What's the cost? Does it have 4 bedrooms versus 3? Like, we geek out on that type of data, and I love that. Specifically with hockey, I like it because there's such a plethora of data emerging with new technology to be able to track things. I geek out on how teams are optimizing deployments of players and stuff like that. So basically a lot of data stuff. I'm also low key, you see me, I'm drinking coffee. One of the things I love about coffee is it's called a pour over method with a Chemex. Basically, it allows you to try and test a bunch of different variables to get different types of flavor profiles within coffee. So you could instead of it being you pour over at 99 or 199 degrees, you pour over at 203, and it's a different flavor profile. Maybe your pour is a little bit slower, different flavor profile. I'm experimenting the heck out of basically everything that I do.
I love
Sometimes
that.
it's toxic.
I was, to be honest, I was going to ask you what's the personality type or a mindset had that an experimenter wears, and you sort of already covered that, right?
I mean, a lot of it too, I think, is a lot of learning, a lot of knowledge, a passion for learning. I can't tell you how many times I'll be in the middle of a call or at trivia night with my friends, and then something will be said and I'm like, wait, I thought this was this thing, and you're not allowed to use your phone to look up answers, but I'll use my phone to wait, I thought this guy was in this movie, and quickly go to IMDb and oh yeah, he was in this movie, and geek out on that. It's a thing in my head that I like to search for information and get answers. And that's especially an important skill set in experimentation, because it's not a fixation on winning. To me, it's something that I preach a lot, is test to learn, where it's this obsession with trying to not understand what happened, because that's pretty easy to track, but why it happened. the why it happened is critical to the success for the growth of an experimentation program, because just understanding what happened doesn't tell you how to iterate, how to push a concept, or how to back away from a concept, or to try to new things.
Right.
So I think I'm obsessed with, okay, you run a test, this is what happened. Okay, but why did it happen? Let's take a look at the behavior. Let's track these specific things to see if we shifted behavior here. And then as you do that, you uncover even new things to explore. But all that kind of drive and passion for learning is where I think it's one of the extremely important soft skills for experimenters, to just be like
Right.
curious, maybe to a fault, but extremely curious and motivated, which leads to learning.
Love that. I feel like that's become an essential for a lot of fields today, being challenging the status quo, being creative, and just finding answers all on your own. So, and also like a data mindset, like you mentioned. So love that. Uh, before I dive in, maybe more like a fundamental question, but when we look up a lot of case studies or blogs, the terms A/B testing, experimentation, CRO, they're often used interchangeably. And I genuinely want to understand what your thought process is on that.
I'm a little bit of a hypocrite, to be fair, and honest to myself. I hate the term CRO because I think what it does is create a false knowledge of what you're actually doing is. A lot of times, and this is something I'm actually working on right now with a client, with our experimentation maturity product, which is a lot of times what happens is experimentation is a broader scale of basically testing things out, trying out new things, and having the data to track to see if it worked or not, and using that to drive business decisions.
Right.
That's a lot. That's where it should be. That's where CRO, quote unquote, should be. That we're using data to push business decisions. And one of the best ways to do it is to try A versus B and randomly split the traffic to get insights and generate, results based on that.
Yes.
What I think businesses fall is when they hear the industry standard CRO, they think all we can do is optimize conversion rates. But the KPIs for experimentation can be whatever you want. It could be on a blog post. It could be time spent on site, multiple blog pages viewed, newsletter signups. It could be whatever KPIs you want, you can experiment with. We are scientists, or at least we should be scientists at the end of the day. But what ends up happening is leaders will say, oh, CRO is the buzzword. I will hire a CRO person and they will optimize my conversion rates. And then they box this person into literally only being able to test into things like button colors and button everything. And that's where it's unfortunate for those people, because it's leadership pushing down these artificial barriers,
right,
for what experimentation should be a much broader scale to affect business change. They're being boxed into this narrow thing. So that's why I hate CRO. To be fair, as me being a hypocrite, basically a lot of my memes use the word CRO. And it's more because, one, low key, it is an industry standard thing. But two, if I have to put experimentation on my memes, it's harder to share and harder to read. So I know I'm being a hypocrite about it, but I truthfully do not like the term CRO, despite that I use it in my memes, because of the implications that it says. A/B testing is synonymous with experimentation. I don't think there's a wrong way to use the either. Although even within A/B testing, people might think where you're only testing 2 variations. Yeah, it could be ABN. It could be 3 variations. It could be 500 if you want. I kind of, depending on the circumstance, recommend not doing 500 variations. But to each his own. I know that companies have done it with success, but I think experimentation is the term that I'd like to try and push within the industry, because I think it encompasses exactly what we need to do. Doesn't create artificial barriers. And at the end of the day, we are scientists. We're not button color optimizers. So
I love that. I love that. Just read so much about all this, so that helps. That sort of, I feel like that brings me also to your mantra. And maybe if you'd like to tell us what that means to you: test to learn and not test to win. Although you've spoken about that already a lot.
Yeah. So the reason why I say test to learn, not test to win, is because if you run a program based on insight generation, you will win far more than a program based on simply just winning. And there's some caveats to running a test to learn program. Things like sometimes there will be tests that break the rule of you've generated 5 insights. You know that based on all these insights and tests in the research, that this is a test absolutely worth, you know, going balls to the walls and trying a really big
Mhm.
design to swing for the fences. And that's where you hit some of those big test wins. But that is only predicated on the fact that you've run multiple tests to understand this is the direction we should be going.
Yes.
If you're just running tests to win tests, and every like you're not tracking the things you need to do to learn properly about your audience, in
Right.
my opinion, you're wasting a test. Because even within the test to learn, or within the test to learn program, win or lose, you've generated an insight, and that's still a net value. And
Yeah.
that's how I approach like research. So if you do a user testing survey, you pay money to generate insights. It doesn't directly do anything to your business by paying for user testing, but what it does is help you generate insights that will ultimately help you win. So that's kind of how I approach experimentation. And a lot of times, I think that's why experimentation and research and UX are so closely tied together. Some of
Right.
my best friends are UX people, is because I view it as almost like a tool in the toolkit of a better user experience, just like
Mhm.
user research is a tool in the toolkit of a better user experience tool bag, so to speak.
Mhm. Uh, this is amazing. Also, funny how sometimes it's also about how many, like your testing velocity, for example, because otherwise there's just so much pressure on making one test work, right? Like this has to go right because that this is probably the only thing we're doing. So you're so scared
Mm-hmm.
to make it fail. And there's like, and I've experienced that in D2C brands, and so that's quite a mindset difference, like when you're looking at it holistically. And that's also how scientific experiments happen at the end of the day. It's about reading data and learning from them. So yeah,
Yep.
love that. Just also understanding, so majority, for example, D2C brands today, a majority of them, about 71%, they're between in the US, between the GMV of $1 million to $5 million. And D2C teams, they're often shorthanded, lack of resources, not enough expertise on these scenarios, which is why they read up on a lot of best practices. Also, would you in that space say experimentation is still for everyone?
I I have a very strong opinion about best practices, in that it is a misnomer for a lot of people that they believe, based on the definition of the word, that you can adopt these things to basically guaranteed success. It's been industry tested, so it's something you could adopt and will have success.
Right.
There are certain things that are truly defined as best practices, which is like have copy be easy to understand, right? That's a best practice. Like, what's the alternative? You have copy that's hard to understand. Like, no, that doesn't make any sense. So
Mhm.
simplifying copy is a best practice. How you execute on that can be, you know, dependent on a lot of factors. But if you want to think more strategically, like make it easy for users to convert,
Yes.
generally a good idea. But then if you get into the nitty gritty of like your call to action should be green because 5 other people tested it and they're big companies, that's where I fall into, I don't agree with the principle of tagging this as best practices. Call it a pattern. I think that's fair. Call it a thing that's been tested a bunch of times. Like that's fair. But
Yes.
I have a problem with the term misnomer, or I not misnomer. I have the problem with the term best practice because I think it's a misnomer and it misleads people into assuming something will work
Mhm.
when it truly doesn't. My counter to people who say like I don't have enough traffic to test,
Yes.
I'd say there are other opportunities for you to learn more about your audience in the same way, not necessarily running an A/B test. There are other things you could do, like selfish plug for winter, which is a tool that we have as a sister company of Speero that helps you test different templates. Um, I'm not trying to put a sales pitch on it, but it's a pretty badass product that I use quite a lot with a lot of our clients. So that's something that you could do pretty cheaply to test out concepts, get qual and quant feedback. But there are other tools like that. Like user testing is a great way for you to conduct research on new designs and test out concepts. Look at your own research, conduct your own data. I think there's so much greater ROI with conducting your own research, doing your own investigation on your own customers
Right.
than making a leap to say, Amazon tested this thing, therefore we can just do it, because it also implies that you have the same audience as Amazon, which is just, you have no way of proving that unless you got Amazon's data, which I'm sure they're not, like, they'll never share that to you.
Right.
And you'll have to do some scientific controls to control for both of those. So people like to say, like, well, you got to start somewhere. And I'd say, fine, like if your principle is you have to start somewhere and that you're gonna like copy someone else, like
Yes.
I guess, but that's a toxic mindset of like starting with copying, because I think that will only beget more copying. When instead you should focus on, I'm going to deliver something that I know isn't great, but I know I'm going to continue to iterate and make it better using testing, using research on our own customers. And I think that's a much better mindset with proven success rather than like training yourself to copy.
That's great. I love how all of this really starts with the mindset because that really matters, right? Before you really kick anything off. Uh, could you maybe tell us more about experimentation maturity? I'm aware that that's something you work on, so would love to know how that caters to different businesses.
Yeah, so the product that I'm working on, I mean, it's complete, but we're continuing to make better. Again, we're not done with it. We're continuing to iterate and make it better because that's what we are.
Mhm.
We don't let just things just sit the way they are. But it's basically a tool that allows you to quickly check how mature your experimentation program is. It ranks. I'm sure you'll share a link, or I'm happy if you guys want to reach out to me. I'll share you guys a link to kind of score your own maturity. But basically, what it is a audit, a very quick audit to let you know where you rank in the maturity of your program. But come talk to me, come talk to Edgar. We're two people who are here to help you scale up your experimentation program so you get better at experimentation maturity, which means you're running better experimentation programs, not necessarily running better experiments, which is part of it, but it's taking a look at the holistic program to say, these are things you could do to scale up and get better at a program, better program management, better automation, better tools, upskilling the people within your program so um, they're more qualified to do kind of broader things, which all of those things help you grow up and scale up the program, not just necessarily thinking a little bit more tactically about the experiments themselves.
That's quick. Could you maybe also quick dive into the different stages?
Yeah, I'll have to like look at the stages. I don't truthfully have them memorized because my memory absolutely sucks. But it's looking at things between like if you're kind of a beginner stage, you're maybe a one person team, or maybe you don't even have a tool, but you at least have the mindset of I need to test some things. So maybe you do pre and post testing and you have a data analyst. But like the beginner stage is at least you're aware of experimentation, you recognize the values of it, but you're not doing it at the top levels. There's a squishy middle ground where depending on your resourcing, depending on your tools, maybe
Mhm.
you have a whole team of 3 dedicated developers, 2 dedicated designers, and a program manager, but you haven't linked your experiments to business strategy. You're running button color tests. You're running things that the business looks, and leadership looks at this as like, I don't get where the value is. Or maybe you're not tracking lifetime metrics. So that maybe will put you in the squishy middle ground if you're not mature. You're getting there, you're
Mhm.
taking steps forward, but you're not mature. And these are some things you could do. And then like as you progress up, maybe you have linked it with business strategy, but still your automation isn't totally there. Or maybe you've outgrown your own testing tool and you need to build your own testing tool so you
Yeah.
can accelerate the velocity even more. Maybe there's certain things like you have to break the silos between the UX teams that you have, and they're not communicating changes well with your process of experimentation. So there's like, that's how there's little tactical things like that, but they all aggregate up to giving you a overall maturity. But what we like to do is lay a roadmap to say, these are the things you should do to
Mhm.
get better at experimentation programs so that you can scale. And a lot of these things help you like a positive cycle. As you grow a bigger and better experimentation program, you generate more visibility, you show better progress, you show how awesome experimentation is. And then people are like, blank check, here's the money, go do what you got to do to spend to get even more and invest more in the program. And that's that cycle of positivity to just keep on investing more and more into the program.
That's quite interesting. That actually gets me to the point that you would say experimentation sort of is for even a 1% team, like one person experimenter, right? So that's great.
Yeah.
I really want to ask you, what would you say are the building blocks of setting up an experimentation program for, say, a D2C brand? And I'm looking at like what's the simplest way maybe for them to get started, if I may?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. And I'd say it really depends on a number of factors, but I'll clarify the it depends piece. I think it depends on things like what is the culture that you have. If you have a culture where top down, everyone loves experimentation, then it'll be easier for you to push forward experiments and get the buy-in that you need to like talk to UX people internally. Even if you're a one-person team, try and see if you can talk to UX people and say, can I get some bandwidth from you? Or top down, have leaders then prioritize UX sprints, development sprints to give you or your team, however many people you may or may not have, is resources to start testing into. If
Right.
top down, you don't have an experimentation mindset from your leadership, it is going to be hard. It's not impossible. I know that there's a lot of debate between this. It's not impossible, but damn, it's pretty hard if you don't have that senior leadership buy-in to get an experimentation growing. That being the case, a lot of breaking those hurdles for me has been on education. So there's a lot of prominent people who I'm not going to name drop, but summarize experimentation into these like small boxes, like I said about before, button colors, super tactical tests. And if that's what your leadership views experimentation as, then of course they're going to be like, this is stupid. I don't care about this. Versus if experimentation is educated towards, you have an idea for building a new product, why don't I go ahead and test your idea in the market to see if it's worth building? Also, I think a lot of times what experimenters do wrong is have it be an us or them, or like people view, a lot of UX people view experimentation as, you're just trying to give me quantitative data to prove that my design is ugly and you're calling my baby ugly and like, fuck you, I don't want to talk to you. But instead it's a partnership. It's a partnership to say, I, experiment person, want to test your UX design to show and give you a quantitative lift to say, your design is so good, when we roll it out, it'll lift conversion rate by 4%. And that's awesome. Also, here's the data sheet. Go show that to your boss when you have your performance review. And that's a great partnership, right? It gives them that quantitative data to help say, I'm here to support you. I think a lot of times people view experimentation as a way to be like challenging ideas. Yes. I think instead it should be a perfect way for people to be like, I'm a more of a blank slate as the experimentation person. Let me take the inputs of the business. Let me take the inputs of what you're trying to do. Let me strategize in my head and jumble it up and then create a plan that supports your vision, supports the business. And I'm here to help you. I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to literally make you look good. And I think that mindset is a good way to help build the program, especially if you're that one-person team. It can be hard, especially if you don't have that top-down buy-in. But assuming you have that top-down buy-in, create these partnerships, create these connections, start to figure out how can I delegate some of this work down to these other teams that are smarter. Or if you have that leadership that's like, I will give you more and more and more investment, then use this to invest in your team. But again, always consider that you're, as an experimentation person, you have to follow rules and principles to do a good program. But ultimately, you're here as a stakeholder to help support the business and support these other functions. I think that mindset really helps get buy-in and really gets people excited with experimentation.
Super. That's great. At the end of the day, like if you keep the user at the center of everything that you do, you're not really overthinking yourself. Like then your ideas don't stand so important because it's all about the user and user feedback, right? So that's great. That sort of brings me to a small game that I'd like to play with you. Just a myth or fact on CRO hacks for e-commerce websites. Would love
Okay.
to see if you think that's a myth or a fact, and also maybe just one or two line on what you think about them. So yeah, are you ready to dive in?
Let's do it.
Okay, just the first one. So the holy grail of CRO, CTAs or conversion actions, should always be above the fold on a product page or sticky.
I just actually commented on this. So I do this YouTube series with one of my coworkers called It Depends. And I think I'm sure a lot of these answers are going to be it depends, but I don't want to just leave it at that. I'll give you kind of my clarification to that. So many B2B companies in particular lead with a conversion action. Like your first landing page on their site, on their homepage is get a demo, get a quote, give me your email. And you're like, dude, I don't even know what you do. Like, don't pester me. It's the same thing like that stupid, annoying salesperson when you walk into the furniture. As soon as you walk in, they're at the door, like, how can I help you? That's great for some people. That's not great for everyone. And it depends on your audience. So I'd say, like, should you have a CTA above the fold? You should definitely test it. It depends on the page and the context. Like maybe if that's the generally speaking, the fourth or fifth page in the user's journey, like maybe that makes a lot more sense because and like someone pushed back on a comment saying like sometimes it's just industry standard to anchor what action you want them to take above the fold. In principle, that makes sense. But in practice, I've literally hidden above the fold call to actions and seen success with overall conversion rates. And the amount of times I've seen people click it above the fold for a lot of these B2B companies is like less than 1%. Sometimes I think the most I've seen is 2%.
Oh.
Again, my sample size is not representative. It's just what I've seen. But it just depends on the page. It depends on so many factors. It's always worth testing. But I'd say for me, conceptually, it's better to understand where that aha moment, that light switch of I'm ready to talk to someone, I'm ready to convert, and then put it there and test into where you can figure out where that is, rather than just like, it's like that super annoying chat bot too, that like you land on the site, as soon as you land on the site, they pop up the 15% off email capture and you're like, no, fuck off, close it. And then the live chat pops up and you're like fuck off, let me just read what you have. And people don't test that. They just assume omnipresent conversion actions, always sticky CTAs is always the best thing. But it always depends, and especially like on mobile, you have these like sticky banners that occupy like 30% of your page, and then you layer on a live chat. I literally can only see, and then like their above the fold menu and their header takes up like 20% of the page. You're left with like a window of like 20% to like try and read while you're trying to like read past the chat bot that pops. Like people don't test this shit. And I just say like the answer is test it, but like put yourself in the user's shoes. If you went to that site first, are you ready to talk to someone? No? Don't pop it up. Test it, but don't pop it up. Try removing it and seeing if there's no negative impacts. What you might be surprised is you'll actually see positive impacts because what you're doing is pissing them off more than helping them. But it depends. It's a long answer.
I love that. I love that. Okay, for the next one, shorter checkout journeys mean more conversions.
I think that generally makes sense. Is that specific to e-commerce or with B2B as well for like lead gen?
I'll let you take the answer for that either way.
I'll say like e-commerce generally, yes, but some like it's the difference between single step and like everything consolidated into like I'm sorry, I don't know, like I'm not using the right words, but like multi-step versus everything consolidated on a single form. I think the same concept works in B2B and B2C, which is that it just depends on how you're executing it. I've run tests in B2B where I've added steps and seen increased conversion rate because what it does is it's not in principle the increased steps. It leads ultimately to increased trust. What are the questions that you're asking? If you ask everything up front, you don't have necessarily a chance to build trust with that person versus, if you have multi-step and you've done user research to understand why the user maybe doesn't trust you, and you ask these questions to build the trust. Like, for example, if you're just like, you land on a site for B2B, and then they're like, you want to talk to us? Great, give me your first name, last name, email, phone number, blah, blah, blah. But a lot of feedback I've gotten from user research is like, you don't know me. So like, this is going to be a waste of my time. You haven't qualified me. I don't trust you. I don't know anything about you. Versus like, if you do maybe potentially multi-step, and the first question you ask is like, do you currently have software? Or like, let's say it's a B2B Asana type company and you're selling project management. Do you currently have project management software? And then like you say, no, I don't. And then you can say, we get it. Like finding the right project management software is hard. Here's what Asana can do. And like you use that to build trust. It's an extra step. It adds additional time technically, but it builds trust. And that's ultimately that was ultimately a good thing for particular clients where I've tested this. I've also added steps and it hasn't increased conversion rate, it's decreased conversion rate. I think with ecom, it just depends on the execution. Like potentially if you're like an Amazon company, potentially, again, just thinking more conceptually, it's easier because these people just want to buy as quickly as possible. So it might be that a shorter path makes sense. But if you're technically ecom, but like your Norwegian cruise line, for example, and when we tested this, it's such a big investment. It's like $2,000 per person to go on this cruise. If you're trying to simplify that process and squeeze it out, there is that lack of trust. There's like, well, why don't you tell me? Like doubts start to creep in, and you're looking at a $5,000 purchase to click a button. A lot of doubts sometimes get ingrained in your head, and you could do little things like do payment plans and stuff like that. But sometimes adding steps build trust. Talk about insurance. Talk about the value. Talk about the excursions, get them excited in every step can help. So it's very context dependent. I don't like creating general rules, but I think there are some guidelines to potentially consider narrowing the conversation down to make it more practical.
That's great. That actually makes sense. I think it's also use case dependent. Like you said, that if the AOV is really high, for example, it's going to take the customer a little more time to trust you. You sort of already covered. I was generally going to ask about the homepage pop-ups and if that is an effective way to capture emails, but I think I sort of know what you think of those anyway. Yeah.
The really annoying thing is it does work. Like it does capture emails, and it does work. But I would say from the user experience perspective, consider testing it with different triggers. So let's say you land on the site for the first time. Does it make sense for them to see 15% off a product they don't fully understand? Probably not. And it'll probably generate emails, but why not instead test a different trigger of, instead of land pop-up, wait for 15 seconds and then pop up, or wait for multiple page views and pop up, or trigger it only on product pages where there's likely much higher interest and you won't piss off other people. So I think it's largely context dependent. Test your own audience to figure out what rules make for you, but they do work. As much as it might piss me off, they do work in the same way that chatbots and stuff do work. But I just say consider just tweaking the triggers, or test tweaking the triggers to see if it generates some greater success.
Awesome.
While not pissing off other people.
Thank you. This has been amazing, just talking to you. A lot of deep insights. So thank you so much for talking to us. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as well.
For sure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, super, super great to have you here with us.
Cool. And definitely follow me on LinkedIn if you like Speero memes.
Will do.